So here in step 5, what we're trying to do is make changes so that we can add some of our objects to our database. So we're going to go through basically 3 steps today. We're going to change the dialog, so it's going to create and return an object. Okay, we're going to change the database, and that's on the next page, so that it keeps track of an array of objects, and then change it so that the add button works. Okay, so you guys are going to be kind of following along on here as I'm over on Eclipse looking at the code and explaining what needs to happen. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so here's the comic book dialog as it stands. Like I just said, this stuff got removed from the notes that you have. So you should see GUI components removed there and then comic book. Okay? Then in comic book dialog, what we need to do is we need to make it so that this dialog basically belongs to another frame. Okay? Because what we want it to do is we want it to return the comic book that's being made to that frame, okay, to the class that defines the frame. So in order to do that, we're going to change the constructor of comic book dialog so that it receives a JFrame, which it's going to refer to as its owner. Okay, so some of you are paying attention and filling that in. Some of you are not. Let's get 100% attentive here. Okay? The next line of code that's going to change for you guys is inside of here we're going to call to the super constructor. And we talked about this a little bit the other day, but just to review what that means. Because up here we're declaring that comic book dialog extends JDialog, what that means is comic book dialog is a JDialog and inherits everything that a JDialog can publicly do. Okay? It also inherits the characteristics of a JDialog, the variables of them, but it can't like easily access them unless JDialog says they're easily accessible by making them public. Okay, so I'm kind of going off on a tangent a little bit, but basically what we did last year that should make this make some sense is, for example, we talked about an asteroid, a ship, a laser are all moving objects. They all extend moving objects in the asteroids game. We talked about X and O extends mark in the tic-tac-toe game that we made. We also, throughout the whole class, made our new classes pretty much, not all of them, but most of the programs that we wrote extended what we called WASWorld last year. Okay, so we were always saying this is a class that builds off of WASWorld. Okay, extends WASWorld. And now what we're doing is we're saying let's extend JDialog, so we're going to build off of that. When we make a call to the superclass constructor, we're saying JDialog has some constructors that I can use. And we talked about this the other day, so I'm not going to spend too much more time on it, but basically what this means is the super constructor gets a JFrame that we're going to call the owner. This is going to be the title on the top of my my dialog. And then this true means that it's modal. Okay, so I have that in there already for you. True means modal. And what modal does, it is allows the dialog to return an object. Okay, if it's not modal, then it won't. Basically, it won't return an object. Okay, it'll act kind of funny. And so the rest of this stuff is all, I think, there already, except for this, right? We still have to add action listener to the enter button and to the cancel button. So hopefully you have that. And while you guys are copying that down, I'm going to run this so that you guys have an idea of what we're talking about here. Okay, So here's our comic book database. If you can take just a second to look up here, I know you're copying stuff down here, but what we want to have happen at the end of this is that when I click Add, it shows me one of these dialogues. Okay. So this is Add Comic Book. That's what this is supposed to say. If this thing would get out of the way, it says Add Comic Book. Okay. The fact that this is true means that, and I don't know if you'll be able to hear this, but when I click over here, it doesn't let me do that. And so I don't have the speakers hooked up so you guys can hear it, but then you can hear that it's kind of going bonk, bonk. You know, it's telling me you can't do that, right? It's saying you can't do that because you're modal. Once I create you, once you are created as a JDialog, you can't go back to this other thing that's your own until you do whatever you need to do over here. Does that make sense? So eventually what we want to have happen here is when I fill in the title and all that stuff, okay, when I fill that stuff in and I hit enter, what we want to have happen is this enter button makes Spider-Man number 3 show up over here. Okay, so that's what we're trying to accomplish. All right, so in order to do that, that enter button and that cancel button need to have action listener added to them so that we can actually do something when they get clicked. Okay? Just to kind of reiterate the explanation of this, whatever button you make, when you click it, it is creating an action event. And what we're doing here is we're saying this class is going to be listening for those action events. Does that make sense? Okay. So then, let's just jump down to here. The action performed method is the place where we say, when this action event occurs, this is where we're going to go. I'm going to call the action event E right here. Okay? And what I want to know is if the source of that action event is the enter button, or if the source of that is the cancel button. If it's the cancel button, then all we're going to do is say, let the dialogue go away. Okay? And so what that looks like is, if I say add again, and then click cancel, it disposes of the dialogue. Okay? Let me just explain that one more time so that it makes a little more sense to you, okay? I'm going to add another layer to it. So if I click add, this thing has the potential of creating a comic book object. Okay? And I know that you guys are writing stuff down, but I think that you can take 3 seconds and just look up at the screen. Okay? This thing has the potential of creating a comic book object. But objects have basically 2 states that they can be in. They can be null, or they can be an actual instance of that class. Does that make sense to you? When I click cancel, which of those 2 states is the object going to be in? It's going to be null. Does that make sense? Okay? Because all we're doing is we're saying dispose of this thing, don't make an object, but go away. Okay? When I click enter, I'm going to go to this enter method. All right? Do you guys need more time to copy this stuff? Okay. Are we good? All right, I'm going to go to the enter method here. So, when the enter button is clicked, we're going to go to the enter method. Okay? The enter method is up here. And basically what I want you to do is understand that all we're doing right here is we're saying make a variable called title that's going to keep track of whatever's in the title text field. So the title text field .getText is saying, again, basically when we are clicking add, we're looking here, and if we do something like, big surprise there, issue 1, volume 3, good issue. Okay. Okay. Oh, sorry. I don't remember when that came out, but let's say 2004. Okay. What we're doing right here in the highlighted text, highlighted code here, is making title equal to Captain America. So title tf.getText is just saying take whatever text is in here and assign it to the variable title. Okay, I think you guys get that. Am I right? Okay. So the next thing we want to do is we want to get the text out of the issue text field. However, the issue has to be a number, and more specifically, it has to be an integer. And so we need to change this string into an integer, and the way we do that is with this integer.parseInt method. Is this making sense? Okay. Same thing for the volume. We need to change that into an int. The cover price is going to be a decimal, so we're going to store that into a double variable. Month is an int, year is an int, and then we're going to create the book that we have a reference to in this class. And what I want you to do is look up at the top where it says comic book book, the top of your code. You guys have that? That's the book that we're making. Okay, it has to be a global variable because we want to refer to it in the enter method. We also are referring to it right here in the getBook method. And we're going to be referring to it more than that when we start adding more functionality to this thing. Are you guys following me? Okay. So after we create the book, then we tell this thing, now it's okay for you to go away. Now the book is in the other state than what we talked about before, right? The book is not null anymore. The book is an instance of the class comic book. Are you guys following that? Okay. What I want to show you, another thing here is this. So if I say volume 3 here, okay, and I click enter, it's going to say make sure issue, volume, cover price, and year fields are numbers. So that's an error message, and the way that that happens is because of this try-catch block. Okay, so this try-catch block is telling me basically try to do this stuff, but we know that people are going to be dumb and they're not going to put in numbers where they should put in numbers. So we might get a number format exception. And if you are unfamiliar with that, you should think about exceptions as errors, basically. We have a number format error. Okay? And then when that number format error happens, we're catching it and we're basically saying, okay, show these people a message that says make sure the issue volume and blah, blah, blah. You just read that. Does that make sense? So you can fill that in with whatever you want. Make sure issue, volume, cover price, and year fields are numbers. We could do this a little more specifically. Like we could say, try to get the issue. Catch the number format exception. Try to get the volume. Catch the number format exception. Try to get the double, the cover price. Try to get the month. Try to get the year. So we could break it up like that. And then you could be more specific and say, there's an issue with there, you have to fix the issue. It's got to be a number. You have to fix the volume. It's got to be a number. But I just kind of did it as a catch-all. Okay? Yeah.
So with this where it pertains to earlier with the getting the index and everything, for a combo box, I have like 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5. Should I just get the like what we did with the string last year and then make it into a double?
It kind of depends. So the question was like, what if you have numbers in your combo box, but you can't refer to them basically straight away? Like you can't, like if you have decimals in your combo box. So one way you could do that is you could get item instead of get index, right? Like we talked about, we talked about that the other day. And then you could parse that into a double. That would be one way to do it. Another way to do it is if you have, like, if it starts at 1 and then it's always an increment of 0.5. So you could get the index, cast it to a double, and then divide it by, like, the total number that you have. And then that would, I think, give you the decimal value. Does that make sense? So there's a couple ways of doing that. Okay. Anybody need more time with the enter method? Is this making sense now? How this works? We did something like this last year, right? We did this with when we created words for the Hangman project. Okay? Not with this much detail necessarily, but we did something similar. Okay? The last thing that we need to fill in is this getBook method. Okay? And basically this getBook method, it doesn't look very substantial, but it does the work that we want it to do. Okay? Now, before I forget, there's one thing that you might need to change on your dialogue, and that is down here where we have pack, you might have this dot set visible true, or just set visible true. Okay? You want to get rid of that. Okay, so make a note to yourself that set visible true should be in the getBook method. And what you might want to do is just like make a note to yourself this way, and say like this comes from there. Okay, so basically the idea is we want to construct this thing, but we don't want to show it to them until they click add on the database. All right, and we'll see that code in a second. But we don't want them to be able to see this until they click add. And the reason for that is because it's modal, right? If we set it visible, they won't be able to do anything on the database. Okay. Once it's visible, it waits for itself to be disposed before it does anything else. And the next thing that it wants to do is return the book. Okay? What are the two states that the book can be in? Null or be an object, right? So if you want, you could add something like this. Book with 2 Ks is either null or an instance of comic book. Okay? Does this phrase make sense to you? Instance of comic book? Basically means it's an object, but we want to start using some of this vocabulary more, you know. So it's an instance of comic book. Okay? That's important for us to understand that book can either be null or an instance of comic book. When is book null? When you click cancel, right? When is book an instance of comic book? When you click enter and there were no errors. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so then we've pretty much filled in the dialogue for what we want it to do now. Okay, so later on we're going to fill in stuff so that the dialogue can edit books, right? And we might do something else, but for now all we care about is that I can add something to my database. Okay, so in the comic book database then, and you guys have this on the second page. So we filled stuff in there. So now we're looking at the database. In the database, the first thing that you want to do is you want to say, I have an array of objects that I can add to, and I have a variable that keeps track of how many of those objects I have. Okay, so I have a comic book array called books for me, and I'm thinking that 100 comic books is enough because I'm not going to use it, and let's be honest, if it was really a comic book database that I was going to use, I'd need way more than 100, buddy. Alright, so this is obviously for your object, not mine, but we're going through comic books, okay? Book count keeps track of how many objects we have in the array, and so it's going to start at 0. Okay? Eventually we're going to add stuff to the database so that we can read all the comic books from a file that is going to get updated and everything like that. Okay? So hopefully that is making sense, and that's stuff that we did last year as well. Okie doke. So I think you have the rest of this stuff. Again, add action listener to the add button. You also want to add these add action listener to the other buttons. Okay. Okay, that's line 44, just in case you don't have that. It's up at the top now. Okay, action perform method. In the action perform method, we want to know, is the source of the action that just happened the add button? And if it is, go to the add method. Kind of a theme for us now, right? And then we have this code inside of the add method. And the idea behind the add method is we need to create a comic book dialog so that we can get a book from it. So this constructs the comic book dialog and says the database is the owner of the dialog. Does that make sense? Okay. This next line is going to get a comic book that we're going to call new book, and that's going to come from the comic book dialog that I called CBD. So cbd.getBook does, you guys, I'm going to flip over here in a second here. So cbd.getBook does this stuff. Sets the thing to true, and then waits for it to be disposed, right? Back here in the database, what are the two values that the new book can be? Null or an instance of comic book. Does that make sense? If new book is not equal to null, then what must it be? It must be an instance of a comic book, right? And what that means is I want to add it to the array. Okay? So I want to take the new book and put it in the place of book count inside the array of books. Are you following that? Read that line 58 and make sure that that makes sense to you. Any questions on what's going on there? After I add new book to the array at book count, then I want to say I added a book, so let's increase book count by 1. And then I want to show that change, and so I have to add the books. I have to set the list data of the list that we're looking at on the left of the database to be the refreshed books array, basically. Is that making sense? Okay, so let's just look at one. Okay, so can you guys see that okay? Am I covering up code that you need to look at? Okay, I just want to draw a picture of this for you. I'm going to use my new fancy toy here.
You got it back?
If I can. Yeah, actually, they bought one for me, which is nice.
Ooh. Wow.
Yeah, I'm big time.
They can get us a normal t-shirt.
Yeah, you know, I put my pants on in the morning just like you guys, but one leg at a time. But when I put on pants, I make gold records. So, okay, so this is the idea. That's an old Saturday Night Live skit. So this is books. Okay. Index 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and index 99. You guys getting this?
Yeah.
Right now what we have is we have something in here, and that thing is a comic book that has a title equal to Spider-Man. Does that make sense? This is Spider-Man right there. Okay? All right? It has a bunch of stuff in here. Okay? Right now, 1 is null. It's not working exactly the way I want it to, but 1 is null. You guys get it? Okay? After I click enter over here, right? New book is going to be whatever book I get out of the comic book dialogue, which is going to be Captain America issue 1 volume. I'm going to fix that. 299 10 2004. You guys got it? That book will not be null, so that book will go into wherever book count is. What do you guys think book count should be?
2.
Why do you think it should be 1?
Oh, it started at 0.
It started at 0. Why is this being so janky? So book count should be 1. Books at book count will equal the new book, which is this Captain America book that we have. That will go in here, right? So that'll be a reference to another book called Captain America. Are you guys getting this?
Yes.
Book count will increase by 1, so now we'll have 2 books in there. And then we'll set the list data to this array, so we should see Captain America over here when we're all done with that. Is this making sense?
Okay.
Okay, so let's do that. Oh, can't do that apparently. Let's do that. Let's click enter, and there's Captain America. Okay, if you run into that problem where it's like, well, it's cutting stuff off, you could also do this dot pack there, and then it would resize it when you make something that's bigger. Okay. So here's my database again. What we just saw was if I do Captain America, issue 1, volume 2, 299, and I enter that. Did you guys see? I don't know if you see it, but it kind of it made it bigger. It made the list wider so it could fit that. Okay. The other thing that I didn't talk about, but you probably want to do, is in the comic book dialogue, you don't want it to have a main method. You want your database to have a main method. That's where we go through. That's what we use. We don't want the dialogue to have a main method. So yours might already have one. Maybe make a note at the bottom of your dialogue notes. Maybe make a note at the end of your dialogue notes that you want to get rid of your main method. Okay? Any other questions, guys?